Peter Sellers' name conjures immediate associations with brilliant comedic timing, unhinged physicality, and a capacity for outlandish characters that marked him as one of Britain's most unique exports to Hollywood. Yet behind that veneer of inventive genius lay a deeply troubled soul, a child thrust on stage from near infancy, an adult forever chasing love and validation, and a mercurial star whose mood swings, tantrums, and insecurities wreaked havoc on professional sets and personal relationships alike. By the end of his life, he had garnered the highest accolades in his craft, Golden Globe and Oscar recognition, only to succumb to the same impulses and heartbreaks that had dogged him since his earliest years. This is the complicated tapestry of Peter Sellers, comedic virtuoso, comedic tyrant, flawed family man, and unquiet soul. Those who glimpsed him from a distance, fans in the 1960s enthralled by the slapstick brilliance of Inspector Clouseau, may have imagined a zany, playful eccentric living a life as breezily fun as his comedic routines. But the inside story proved dramatically less cheerful. Sellers was the product of a turbulent childhood. He was born Richard Henry Sellers on September 8, 1925, in the seaside resort area of Southsea, Portsmouth, England. His parents, Bill and Peg Sellers, toiled in the variety circuits, traveling from town to town for shows, a precarious existence that left them little time to provide consistent nurturing for their boy. In some ways, it's as if he was destined for the stage. His mother carried him on at just 2 weeks old for a cameo in one of her comedy skits, ensuring that the roar of a theater crowd was ingrained in him from the earliest possible moment. That sense of performance from infancy never quite left him. Yet, ironically, the comedic mania that would make him a household name was rooted in personal confusion. Peg Sellers' intense devotion to Peter oscillated between protective fuss and manipulative interference. She was by all accounts a domineering presence in his life, an influence that many have described as controlling, even stifling. The comedic irony is that while she promoted his early stage appearances, she also saddled him with contradictory demands about discipline and about how a child star should behave. According to his friend and collaborator Spike Milligan, the mother-son relationship ventured into territory that felt psychologically odd for a grown man. Sellers' self-esteem, sense of identity, and eventual mental health battles might well trace back to Peg's overbearing presence. Those earliest comedic seeds sprouted further when Sellers joined the Royal Air Force in World War II. His father had insisted he find some stable direction, but the young man ended up spending more time entertaining his fellow servicemen than focusing on duties. After the war, he quickly made a beeline for the BBC, striving to secure an audition by calling up a producer while impersonating established star Kenneth Horne over the phone. This brazen tactic succeeded, a testament to his innate chameleonic flair, and he soon locked down a spot in BBC radio comedy programs. By the late 1940s, he was making enough waves to team up with two other comedic mavericks, Harry C. Combe and Spike Milligan. Together they formed the core of The Goon Show, which launched in 1951 and ran through much of the 1950s. Experimental, surreal, and unbridled, The Goon Show reconfigured British radio comedy forever, influencing future luminaries like Monty Python's founding members. Sellers' mastery of multiple voices, personalities, and comedic energy made him indispensable to the show, and his reputation soared. Even as that comedic synergy blossomed, his personal life was edging into difficulty. He married his first wife, Anne Howe, sometimes credited as Anne Hayes or with a variant name, an Australian actress, and they had 2 children. But Sellers seemed never to settle into domestic normalcy. His traveling performance schedule, his mother's infiltration of their daily decisions, and his rising sense that he was destined for Hollywood greatness all conspired to overshadow marital harmony. He would vanish for film shoots or comedic tours, leaving Anne to juggle childcare. When he returned, he could be critical and cold, as if exasperated by the ordinary demands of fatherhood. In the 1950s, Sellers began dabbling in film roles. He found minor success with Ealing comedies like The Lady Killers, 1955, in which one of his idols, Alec Guinness, starred as the ringleader of a criminal gang. Sellers's comedic dryness and off-kilter brilliance helped him stand out, though he wasn't quite top billing yet. This period also saw the seeds of Sellers's intense insecurities about measuring up to revered British comedic actors like Guinness. On set, he'd fret about lines, deliver comedic mania in a single take, then retreat into shy gloom. Colleagues found him both magnetic and exasperating. He'd either be unstoppable comedic energy or moody reclusion. As time wore on, that staccato pattern only intensified. His personal life deteriorated further when, in 1960, he agreed to star opposite Sophia Loren in The Millionaires. Some say he insisted on the job specifically to get close to Loren, whom he had developed a near-obsessive crush on. By that point, Sellers was deeply unhappy in his marriage, convinced that stardom, or possibly extramarital affairs, would fill the void. He returned home from filming to announce that he had fallen in love with Loren, a confession that all but blew up his marriage. He also allegedly woke his 6-year-old son in the middle of the night to ask if he should divorce the child's mother. It was an astonishing act of emotional immaturity, further illustrating how little boundary he had between his personal desires and the well-being of those around him. Unsurprisingly, the marriage ended soon afterward in 1962, though the actual legal battles and custody complexities took time to resolve. While that meltdown was happening, Sellers' professional fortune soared to new comedic heights. The Pink Panther, 1963, directed by Blake Edwards, introduced the world to Inspector Jacques Clouseau, a role that elevated Sellers from respected comedic player to international comedic superstar. Audiences adored Clouseau's bungling brilliance, the slapstick mania laced with Sellers' comedic dryness. He exerted a major creative influence on the character, going beyond the script's outlines to refine everything from Clouseau's accent to the bungling physical gags. Comparisons to Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton circulated, praising his capacity for purely visual comedic expression. He scored Golden Globe and BAFTA nominations, forging a comedic brand that overshadowed all his prior comedic achievements. The film's success led to an entire Pink Panther franchise, a comedic goldmine for Sellers. Yet comedic success did not quell his demons. Sellers' mental health issues grew more visible. Shy insecurity in early years gave way to an unpredictability that co-stars and directors found maddening. Increasingly, he practiced borderline superstition. He became phobic about certain colors, green and purple, to an extreme degree. On a set, if he or anyone else wore green, or if stage decorations featured purple hues, he'd throw fits of rage. He'd lash out physically if someone accidentally showed up wearing something that triggered his mania. He also believed in mediums and spiritual gurus, apparently convinced that the ghost of Victorian-era comedian Dan Leno guided him. Astrologer Maurice Woodruff was a near-permanent fixture in Sellers' life, as he'd sometimes refused to make career decisions without consulting the stars. Professionally, even as he landed another iconic comedic triumph in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, 1964, portraying 3 distinct roles, he was becoming known for prickly behavior on set. Kubrick was a director he respected, so the tension was more subdued. But under lesser directors, Sellers pushed boundaries. The comedic mania that enthralled audiences came with an unpredictably cruel streak behind the scenes. Directors complained about him showing up hours late, picking fights, rewriting scripts to inflate his role, or disappearing altogether. He tried to find personal harmony by marrying again, this time to Swedish actress Britt Ekland in 1964. She was almost 2 decades younger. With fiery passion but also jealousy, he ended up controlling her career and her daily life. A friend recalled that Sellers insisted on approving her clothes, monitoring her phone calls, and even sabotaging her film roles. According to rumors, on one set, he paid a doctor to declare her too ill to continue, so she'd be forced to accompany him. Their fights grew frequent, culminating in bizarre blow-ups. Sellers' own health took a dramatic dip in 1964 as well, while using amyl nitrate as a sexual stimulant with Ekland. He had a series of 8 consecutive heart attacks in the space of a few hours, an extreme medical emergency that nearly killed him. He recovered physically, but the incident further escalated his anxieties. Rather than rethinking his lifestyle, he seemed to pivot to new methods of control and new medications, compounding the emotional turmoil in the household. Peter Sellers' collaboration with Britt Ekland in The Bobo, 1967, stands as a stark illustration of how his personal turmoil could destabilize a film set, overshadow the comedic potential of the project, and inflict lasting psychological harm on those closest to him. By this point in Sellers' life, he had already faced multiple heart scares, disrupted productions, and a fraught reputation for on-set tantrums. Yet few episodes showcased his escalating insecurities and destructive impulses more publicly than this ill-fated comedic venture, ostensibly a breezy romance featuring a real-life husband and wife as the leads. As the project kicked off in Spain, Sellers was convinced that The Bobo would serve as a whimsical cinematic playground for him and Ekland. The movie was adapted from a novel by Bert Cole, originally titled Olivar, though changed significantly in tone, and it positioned Sellers as a charming, if bumbling, would-be singer, aiming to woo a glamorous star played by Ekland. At a glance, it offered the comedic mania Sellers typically excelled at: slapstick, mistaken identities, comedic lines delivered with a broad accent, while also giving the couple a chance to share their real-life chemistry on screen. But from day one, tensions permeated the set. Sellers, already unsettled from prior filming misadventures, like the fiasco of Casino Royale, and stoked by his superstitious fears, found myriad reasons to bristle at the production's decisions. He and director Robert Parrish clashed early over comedic emphasis in certain scenes. Parrish wanted a light, romantic air, while Sellers insisted on rewriting comedic bits to highlight his own brand of comedic dryness, overshadowing the rest of the cast. Meanwhile, he fussed over trivial details such as the color of costumes or set props, still driven by the bizarre phobias of green or purple that had dogged him since earlier Pink Panther installments. Compounding these creative frictions was Sellers' deteriorating relationship with Ekland. They had wed in 1964 after a whirlwind courtship that overshadowed the significant age gap — Sellers was nearly 20 years her senior — and his mounting insecurities. For a time, he played the doting husband, orchestrating lavish gifts, praising her comedic potential in interviews, and naming her as the one bright star who matched his comedic illusions. But behind closed doors, an undercurrent of control and jealousy pervaded. He insisted on approving her wardrobe for public events, disliked the presence of male co-stars around her, and made it plain that her entire schedule should revolve around his whims. During The Bobo, these tensions erupted into more frequent and more public spats. Sellers felt that Eklund's comedic talents, though present, were overshadowed by her youth and starlet aura, which he simultaneously craved and resented. Witnesses on set noted that if Eklund delivered a comedic line that garnered too much laughter from the crew, Sellers would mope or lash out. One day, he ranted that the script favored her comedic bits, urging the writers to reduce her lines and bolster his own. Another time, he demanded that lighting for her close-ups be toned down so as not to overshadow his presence. The environment grew toxic. The comedic mania that should have propelled the Bobo devolved into a behind-the-scenes meltdown featuring near-daily bickering between the married leads, overshadowing any chance for authentic comedic synergy. Rumors circulated that Sellers threatened to walk off the project if producers wouldn't yield to his requests, which included everything from last-minute script rewrites to specialized catering for his superstition-based dietary concerns. At one juncture, he insisted on a new costume for his character, claiming the original had greenish undertones. When the wardrobe department provided a slightly different color scheme, he reportedly hurled a furious tirade, accusing them of sabotaging him. Meanwhile, Eklund strove to remain professional but felt increasingly battered by these swings of emotion. She confided to a close friend that the comedic illusions overshadowing her husband's better qualities had turned him into a figure she scarcely recognized, a man so beholden to suspicion, jealousy, and fear that each day on set felt like crossing a minefield. The culminating blow arrived when Sellers demanded that director Parrish fire Eklund outright, presumably for some perceived slight or dissatisfaction with her performance. He cast her as incompetent or not comedic enough, though many on set believed the real issue was that their personal conflict had peaked. Eklund was humiliated, forced to watch as her husband, her comedic partner off-screen, lobbied the production to dismiss her. The producers balked while they recognized Sellers' star power. Outright firing his wife mid-shoot would generate negative headlines and an incomplete film. Sellers pressed the matter until it became clear that he was serious about leaving if she stayed. The tension soared, overshadowing any comedic illusions for the rest of the crew. Ultimately, a compromise was reached that left Eklund effectively sidelined for the remainder of filming. And although she did remain on the project in some capacity, the event signaled the death knell for their relationship. The environment turned dismal, the comedic spark gone. Tragically, in the midst of this swirling chaos, Sellers received news that his mother, Peg, had suffered a heart attack. Observers presumed he'd pause the shoot or dash back to Britain to be at her side. But he was so consumed by his meltdown with Eklund and his frustrations on set that he delayed making any immediate trip. Some said he tried to manage it through phone calls, believing he could rectify family matters later once filming stabilized. Others recall that he might have been too mired in superstitious angst. He was rumored to have told someone that traveling immediately would bring bad energies if he left the film undone. Whatever the rationale, he did not go. Peg died soon after, leaving Sellers stricken with guilt that overshadowed all else. According to multiple sources, he never forgave himself for not being there. This was no mere exaggeration. Many of his friends and co-workers recounted how the mother-son bond was complicated and deeply intense. He had once told them that missing her final moments was his ultimate failing, a sorrow that would weigh on him for the rest of his short life. In addition, the fiasco with the Bobo overshadowed the comedic output as well. The film, released later in 1967, flopped spectacularly at the box office, receiving tepid reviews. Critics who might have embraced a whimsical Sellers-Eklund romance found the final product oddly disjointed. The comedic mania that typically energized a Sellers vehicle was replaced by a sense that the leads had no chemistry. Scenes felt half-hearted, as though the performances were going through mechanical motions. Several comedic bits, originally intended to be centerpieces, landed flat, overshadowed by behind-the-scenes tension that bled into the camera's lens. The press savaged the film, calling it a misfire from an actor who had recently soared with the Pink Panther. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the meltdown spelled the end of the Sellers-Eklund marriage. She recognized that their union could not withstand the hostility, unpredictability, and mental strain that had become the norm. The emotional scars from being told to your face that your own husband wants you fired for overshadowing his comedic presence were simply too deep. Following Peg's death and the meltdown with the Bobo, Sellers entered a new downward spiral. Some accounts place him in a state of near-constant depression, picking fights with random acquaintances, binging on sedatives, and unleashing paranoid rants about colleagues conspiring to ruin him. The comedic mania overshadowing his sense of proportion was unstoppable, leaving him distant from reality. The cameo appearances he made in small comedic projects around 1968 to 1969 carried less sparkle. Observers saw a man who sometimes soared with comedic dryness, but just as often became sullen and disinterested on camera. Eklund, for her part, parted ways emotionally soon after the film's completion. The official divorce came not long thereafter, with a swirl of bitterness overshadowing any comedic illusions that might have lingered from their initial romance. She described him in later interviews as a deeply talented but deeply troubled man. She singled out the Bobo shoot as a microcosm of what was happening behind closed doors, a man so obsessed with controlling comedic illusions that he didn't care whose well-being he sacrificed in the process. At the same time, Sellers' grieving over his mother cast a profound pall. For all her domineering traits, Peg had anchored his life in ways he never recognized until she was gone. He reportedly told one friend, "She was the only one who really cared about me," overshadowing the fact that many ex-wives and children might have cared if he let them. Some said he even drifted into attempts at spiritualism, trying to contact Peg's spirit for guidance. The comedic illusions, overshadowed by these new paranormal fixations, only deepened his unhinged mystique. In the longer arc of Sellers' life, the Bobo has become a footnote, a comedic dud overshadowed by meltdown stories. Far from the brilliance of Dr. Strangelove or the unstoppable comedic mania of the Pink Panther, yet its role in catalyzing the collapse of his marriage to Eklund and forcing him to confront the tragedy of missing his mother's last hours makes it pivotal for understanding the gloom that would shape his late 1960s and early 1970s undertakings. The repeated mention of this fiasco in biographies underscores how personal meltdown can sabotage even the comedic potential of a production, turning what might have been a charming romp into an anxious, acrimonious environment. The extramarital tensions, overshadowing jealousy, and recollections of his mother's fatal heart attack fused into a perfect storm from which Sellers could not easily recover. Occasionally, one wonders if a different impetus, some comedic synergy that overshadowed the negativity, or an earlier realization that he needed therapy, could have guided Sellers on a different path. But the meltdown cycle repeated in subsequent relationships. By the time he latched onto the Pink Panther franchise again in the early 1970s, the comedic illusions overshadowed any impetus to deal with mental health. Even as he soared financially and had comedic hits, his personal life was in shambles, culminating in that final ill-fated marriage to Lynn Frederick. The seeds planted during the Bobo fiasco, his disregard for a partner's emotional health, and a meltdown-laced method of controlling film sets, grew deeper roots as the years advanced. In the end, the heartbreak of Peg's death remained with him until his own passing in 1980. In some accounts, he singled out his absence during her final days as among his greatest regrets, overshadowing comedic triumphs or any ephemeral joys. The Bobo, ironically, stands as a testament to how comedic mania can curdle if overshadowed by personal chaos. Instead of giving him a breezy comedic gem, it gave him another meltdown episode that left behind bitterness, destroyed a marriage, and paved the way for further unraveling. And so, within the mosaic of Peter Sellers' life, the Bobo is crucial. It reveals a moment in time when comedic illusions clashed catastrophically with real-life drama, a train wreck that overshadowed not only the film's comedic potential, but also the final chance for him to mend ties with his ailing mother. As is often the case with Sellers' existence, comedic mania overshadowed everything: compassion, sense of proportion, familial duty, leading to a heartbreak that even he, with all his comedic wizardry, could never rectify in the end. On the professional front, after comedic hits like the Pink Panther series and Dr. Strangelove, Sellers stepped into fiascos like Casino Royale, 1967, the James Bond spoof that was star-studded, Orson Welles' Ursula Andress, yet a production nightmare with multiple directors. Sellers clashed with Orson Welles, who reportedly called him an amateur, prompting Sellers to skip the set if Welles was present. Allegedly, the comedic star even decked one of the film's co-directors, Joseph McGrath, in a rage. Ultimately, Sellers walked away from the project before completion, leaving patchwork editing to salvage the comedic set pieces. The fiasco symbolized his declining ability to stay cohesive on set when faced with conflict. Stories of him hurling curses, rewriting lines to make himself less comedic and more heroic, overshadowed the comedic premise of Casino Royale. He sought solace in new relationships. In 1970, he married Moran Quarry, who at 23 was even younger than Eklund had been at their wedding, continuing the pattern of large age gaps that underscored his desire for control. As the 1970s progressed, their union fractured under the weight of Sellers' paranoia and jealousy. Midway through that marriage, Sellers initiated an explosive fling with Liza Minnelli, announcing an engagement mere days after meeting her. This while he remained legally married. The romance fizzled just weeks later, reinforcing the widely whispered notion that Sellers' mental state was unraveling, and that he made these cataclysmic personal decisions based on whim, mania, or a desire to overshadow the pain. Eventually, he divorced Miranda too. Professionally, he latched on to the Pink Panther franchise in the mid to late 1970s as a stable comedic fallback. Audiences still adored Inspector Clouseau, guaranteeing box office returns. Directors, though, dreaded working with him. The comedic mania overshadowed everything once production began, with Sellers frequently rewriting entire comedic set pieces to inflate Clouseau's screen time or comedic heroics. He'd threatened to walk if he wasn't appeased. On The Revenge of the Pink Panther, 1978, co-stars and directors recounted how Sellers would erupt into outbursts if his superstitions were triggered. One day, a minor actor wore a purple garment, and the meltdown that followed shut down filming for hours. Peter Sellers' marriage to Lynn Frederick, his fourth and final union, is often cited by biographers and those who knew him intimately as the most harrowing phase of his turbulent personal life. While each of his previous relationships had unfolded against a backdrop of insecurity, volatile mood swings, and controlling behavior, The dynamic with Frederick encompassed a particularly disturbing level of emotional subjugation. She was decades younger, a gap that not only underscored Sellers's perpetual craving for youthful adoration, but also left Frederick in a precariously vulnerable position. In the recollections of multiple acquaintances, the infantile meltdown style of intimidation that once defined Sellers's approach to Britt Eklund, his second wife, proved mild compared to how he eventually treated Frederick. And that intensification signaled the darker turn his personality took as he aged, an evolution fueled by his superstitions, recurring heart issues, cyclical outbursts, and the unstoppable comedic celebrity he had built over years of Pink Panther mania. To appreciate the ordeal Lynn Frederick endured, one must re-examine the comedic labyrinth that Peter Sellers had come to inhabit by the late 1970s. This labyrinth included the staggering box office success of the Pink Panther franchise, in which Sellers, as Inspector Clouseau, delivered comedic lines that seemed unstoppable in their gift for physical and verbal humor. The public saw him as a comedic genius, a shape-shifting wizard of comedic illusions who had earlier dazzled in Dr. Strangelove and the Return of the Pink Panther. But behind that comedic mania, the real Sellers was infamous for a controlling streak that overshadowed everything else. On film sets, he might ban or fire crew members who wore certain cursed colors, like green or purple, or brazenly rewrite scripts to inflate his role. Now, in 1977, he embarked on a new marriage, presumably hoping to recapture a romantic spark, or stave off the sense of decline creeping over him at age 51. Lynn Frederick was only about 22 at the time they wed. Some sources cite her birth in 1954, others 1953, but all confirmed that she was around her early 20s. She had been a British film actress, though, with a far briefer, less established career than Sellers. Occasionally, she had tried comedic roles or romantic leads in modestly funded British pictures, with only scattered cameo work in mainstream cinema. She was, by all accounts, starstruck by Peter Sellers's comedic brilliance and worldwide acclaim. Understandably so, given that the Pink Panther Strikes Again, 1976, had just proven a robust commercial success, reaffirming that Sellers was not merely a comedic has-been. He was still the comedic star who could pack theaters with his slapstick illusions. Frederick's close friends from that period recall that she seemed simultaneously mesmerized by his comedic aura and fearful of the quicksilver personality shifts that rumor said dogged him behind closed doors. The wedding received tabloid coverage mostly because of the jarring age gap. Sellers had already gone through 3 marriages, culminating in repeated stories of infidelity, jealousy, and meltdown behavior. And now, here he was, seemingly diving headfirst into a union with a young actress nearly 3 decades younger. The comedic illusions in the press tried to spin it as another bubbly comedic star marries his new leading lady, but the reality soon proved far less whimsical. Frederick, in interviews, admitted to being overwhelmed by Sellers's multiple heart attacks and his obsession with mediums, numerology, and color-based superstitions. She had heard rumors of how in prior relationships he demanded that no one appear on set wearing green or mention the color purple lest he throw a violent tantrum. The comedic mania overshadowing him came with an undercurrent of intimidation she did not know how to handle. In private, she confided to her family that he scolded her for trifles, leaving the house without telling him or wearing a color he found inauspicious. Observers from that era recount how Sellers's insecurities hit a new, virulent peak in this period. At times, he'd grown more physically fragile, Repeated heart trouble had forced him to rely on sedation, and he also used stimulants to keep up comedic energy on set. The comedic dryness that once might have balanced his mania had instead devolved into a zero-sum paranoia. If Frederick told him she was going to meet an old friend for coffee, he might suspect an affair. If she spent too long with costumers, he might suspect them of trying to sabotage him or of harming her in some intangible way. Tales swirl that once she wore a pastel lavender blouse, a color that leaned too close to the dreaded purple, to a dinner, and Sellers erupted into a veritable meltdown, forcing her to go back and change before letting them leave. Another anecdote states that he barred her from attending a certain West End show because one of the cast members had previously offended him on a Pink Panther set, and he considered them a green energy saboteur. One might guess that comedic stardom, plus the power it gave him, turned these illusions into unstoppable realities in their household. Freed from meaningful checks and balances, Sellers could punish or reward Frederick at whim. She never quite had the standing to say no. He was older, wealthier, and deeply connected in the film industry. If she wanted to keep working in any capacity, she needed his goodwill. Even so, her own film career nearly evaporated after their wedding. Sources close to Sellers say he attempted to micromanage any role she was offered, suspicious that a directorial or co-star relationship might overshadow his comedic star persona. This forced her into a de facto retirement from her fledgling career, leaving her beholden to him for money, travel, and social engagement. Biographer Roger Lewis, who wrote extensively about Sellers' life, singled out the Frederick marriage as ground zero for the worst aspects of Sellers' personality. If in earlier unions he displayed jealousy and meltdown rants, with Frederick, these impulses took on a relentless frequency. He'd honed a punish and reward system, vacillating between apologizing with lavish gifts, perhaps a pricey necklace or an impulsive weekend in Monte Carlo, and unleashing savage tirades over something as trivial as an incorrectly prepared meal. Frederick, who had grown up with starry-eyed visions of movie romance, found herself living in the comedic star's mansion, overshadowed not just by his comedic mania, but also by the presence of staff who dared not cross him. Everyone walked on eggshells, fully aware that a comedic meltdown could rupture the calm at any moment. By 1978 or so, Sellers' comedic brand soared once more with Revenge of the Pink Panther, a box office smash that reaffirmed Clouseau's comedic immortality. The private cost of that success, though, weighed on Frederick. She witnessed him turning up the comedic mania on set while letting his body languish, refusing to adopt a healthier routine that doctors recommended. She tried to intervene, or so some acquaintances say, suggesting he reduce his chain smoking or moderate his diet to safeguard his heart. He retaliated by calling her controlling, ironically reversing the accusation. He wanted comedic illusions in public, but behind the scenes he demanded unwavering obedience from Frederick. Over time, she became reclusive, rarely seen except when attending a Pink Panther premiere or official function at his side. Her once lively presence, noted by those who had known her as a young actress, had withered into subdued compliance. While comedic mania overshadowed him, Sellers occasionally displayed glimpses of remorse or self-awareness. He might break down in tears after a meltdown, apologizing to Frederick with declarations of love. Yet these contrite intervals never lasted, overshadowed anew by fresh anxieties. What if a co-star betrayed him or a new Pink Panther script threatened to reduce Clouseau's comedic lines? The idea of comedic overshadowing extended to his paranoid belief that younger comedic talents might usurp his place in British film. He railed about the emergence of Monty Python or other comedic groups as though they existed primarily to dethrone him. All the while, Frederick endured whiplash from living with a man whose entire sense of self was in flux. Comedic master, paranoid tyrant, anxious heart patient, and naive dreamer longing for acceptance. In late 1979, the chance to star in Being there provided Sellers with an unexpected pivot. The role of Chance the Gardener seemed to harness his capacity for comedic dryness, but in a subdued, introspective way that contrasted with Clouseau's mania. Freed from the Pink Panther formula, he sank into method acting, requiring Frederick to keep visitors away so he could remain in character. Hal Ashby, the director, recognized the performance as a career pinnacle. Sellers was mesmerizing as the childlike, guileless Chance, reaping comedic confusion in the outside world. The film's critical triumph led to his Golden Globe and a belated Academy Award nomination. In interviews, he bemoaned not having found such roles earlier, attributing blame to the comedic illusions that overshadowed him. Some of the promotional events for Being There saw him give subdued, earnest speeches, praising the understated comedic hush of the film. Frederick, standing near him, presumably hoped this newly softened, reflective Sellers might carry over into real life. Yet, if anything, the film's success reinforced his mercurial sense of entitlement. He felt vindicated, adopting the posture of a comedic giant who'd also proven serious range. Freed from the comedic overshadowing of Pink Panther, or so he believed, he now wanted personal relationships to reflect similar deference. The final months of his life saw an intensification of that controlling approach with Frederick. One friend recounted an ugly confrontation where Sellers discovered Frederick had gone on a casual lunch date with a female friend. He erupted in a public scolding, accusing Frederick of hiding something, humiliating her in front of staff at a posh London restaurant. The comedic mania overshadowed any rational conversation, and they left separately, each deeply embarrassed. In private, Frederick's diaries or letters, snippets of which have surfaced in later years, though never fully published, indicate that she was trapped between adoration for his comedic legacy and fear of his next outburst. She had illusions at the start that by being a devoted wife, she could heal him, offering youthful positivity to counter his darkness. But the illusions eroded day by day as the comedic meltdown pattern repeated. She told a close confidant, "When it's good, it's heavenly. He can be the funniest man on the planet, sweet and childlike." But then something flips, and there's no controlling it. By summer 1980, Sellers had turned 54, bracing to meet with his old goon show pals, Spike Milligan and Harry Secombe, for a nostalgic dinner. He never made it. On July 22, 1980, he succumbed to a fatal heart attack at the Dorchester Hotel in London. The comedic illusions overshadowing the final chapters of his life abruptly ended. Frederick, left a widow at only about 25 or 26, inherited the lion's share of his estate. He had procrastinated on rewriting his will to reduce or exclude her, though rumor abounded that he had intended to do so. His older children from previous marriages received meager sums, a bitter coda to his fractious paternal role. Frederick found herself in a vortex. The press labeled her a gold digger, recalling the narrative that had haunted Sellers' second wife, Britt Eklund, or Anne Woodward, in other aristocratic scandals. She faced hostility from the older children, comedic fans suspicious that she had contributed to his stress, and a swirl of complicated estate battles that overshadowed the comedic brilliance his fans mourned. In the immediate aftermath, Frederick tried to maintain the illusions of a grieving widow. She gave interviews praising Sellers' comedic mania, calling him the greatest comedic mind of his generation. Yet behind closed doors, she sank into depression. Over the next few years, she drifted away from the public eye, made some attempts at business ventures, remarried to talk show host David Frost for a time, then later to others, but never found stable ground. She died in 1994 at 39 from complications related to substance misuse. Some say it was an unintentional overdose. Others lean toward the haunting idea that she, too, had lost the will to live. It was a chilling reflection of the darkness that had overshadowed their union. Given the tragic coda, one might glean that Lynn Frederick was undone by illusions, just as Sellers had been undone by comedic illusions overshadowing deeper truths. She had illusions that comedic stardom and iconic brilliance in a husband would equate to security and love. Instead, she encountered an older man weighed down by superstitions, insecurities, repeated heart trauma, and an erratic personality that no comedic sparkle could offset in private. That synergy of tragedy stands out in film history. The comedic star's final marriage was also his most psychologically destructive, overshadowed by a brand of mania no comedic lines could exorcise. After Sellers' death, certain Pink Panther colleagues reflected that they'd never seen him as unrelentingly controlling as in that last marriage. They recalled that in earlier relationships, while he might spiral into tantrums or paranoid accusations, he also displayed sporadic periods of warm generosity, comedic banter that made the entire set laugh, or fatherly impulses that at least flickered. But by the time he married Frederick, the comedic dryness had given way to an absolute unwavering tyranny in the home. Whether from advanced age, repeated near-death experiences, bitterness from prior divorces, or a general sense of comedic illusions overshadowing his identity. This final marriage thus forms a crucial puzzle piece in understanding who Peter Sellers was at the end of his days. He remained comedic gold at the box office, forging iconic roles until almost the very end. The fiendish plot of Dr. Fu Manchu would be one of his last, though overshadowed by poor reception. But that comedic mania overshadowed any attempts at stable intimacy. The meltdown-laced approach to domestic life was stronger than ever, dooming Frederick to a short-lived status as Mrs. Peter Sellers in an environment of constant tension. Contemporary film fans who revisit Being There or the Pink Panther series might do so with a sense of wonder at the comedic brilliance on display. The comedic illusions overshadow the heartbreak behind them, just as they overshadow the trauma Frederick endured. History, or at least the casual observer, seldom glimpses that final marriage's severity unless reading deeper into Sellers' biography. Yet the documented episodes of rage, the confessions from staff, the diaries from Frederick, reveal a man no comedic illusions could redeem. That, in many ways, is the final act of Peter Sellers' life, comedic mania, unstoppable on screen, unstoppable cruelty behind closed doors, culminating in an early death and a widow left alone, overshadowed by nightmares. Looking back, the entire arc of Sellers' existence hints at how comedic brilliance can walk hand in hand with personal devastation. From the Goon Show camaraderie to Hollywood's comedic adoration, from marriages that soared then crashed, from near-fatal heart attacks to unstoppable comedic illusions that overshadowed all reason, everything telescoped into that final union with Lynn Frederick. The meltdown ratio soared, kindness receded, and the comedic illusions, ironically, turned savage, an unstoppable force that overshadowed both of them until his demise. One can't help but surmise that if Sellers had recognized the depth of his mental health struggles and sought consistent therapy, or if the industry around him had stepped in more effectively, the outcome might have been less dire for Frederick as well. Instead, the cycle repeated illusions, meltdown, an unstoppable chain that ended in heartbreak. Then, in 1979, an unexpected second wind arrived for Sellers' aspiration to be recognized beyond comedic fluff. He starred in Hal Ashby's Being There, a satirical, introspective film adapted from Jerzy Kosinski's novel. Sellers portrayed Chance, a simple-minded gardener whose naive remarks are mistaken for profound wisdom by political elites. Eager to prove he was more than comedic mania, Sellers undertook a near-method approach, limiting public appearances and cultivating an almost meditative calm on set. The performance garnered him a Golden Globe for Best Comedy, musical actor, and an Academy Award nomination, one of the highest validations the comedic star had ever received. He was jubilant, proclaiming that it was the pinnacle of his career, the final justification for all his comedic illusions and personal strife. But in typical Sellers fashion, that triumph didn't translate to peace. He slipped into rehashed patterns of cruelty, especially with his children from previous marriages. One story claims that after Being There opened to rave reviews, Sellers asked his teenage daughter, Victoria, if she thought he looked good in the film. Half jokingly, she said he looked like an old fat man. Incensed, Sellers tossed a drink in her face and commanded she leave his presence. The rift that followed effectively ended their father-daughter relationship. Reports suggest that his eldest daughter, Sarah, criticized him for this outburst, prompting him to retort with a scathing telegram. It's as if the comedic dryness and comedic mania that delighted crowds was overshadowed by a profoundly fragile self-regard, so easily wounded even by a child's teasing remark. By 1980, Sellers' health was precarious. Multiple heart attacks had marred his middle age, culminating in various doctors beseeching him to slow down, reduce stress, and address mental health. The comedic mania that once fueled him risked triggering lethal medical crises. He was only 54 when he planned a Goon Show reunion dinner with Spike Milligan and Harry Seacombe in London on July 22, 1980, a date that never transpired. That same afternoon, he suffered yet another massive heart attack in his London hotel. He died 2 days later in the hospital, leaving behind an estate, ironically, still subject to the whims of the final will he'd never updated. There was talk that he'd intended to cut Lynn Frederick out or drastically reduce her share, but since he didn't finalize those changes, she inherited the bulk of his fortune. His children got a pittance, 800 pounds each, a miserable sum from the multi-million-pound estate of a comedic legend. That final distribution mirrored the heartbreak that overshadowed his familial relationships. Some fans find it incomprehensible that the comedic star behind Dr. Strangelove or the Pink Panther would so thoroughly alienate his kids. But for those near him, it was an inevitable outcome of a man who could never find emotional equilibrium. The comedic mania, the illusions of unstoppable comedic brilliance, masked a deep dread that he might be worthless, if not entertaining. He was clinically depressed, possibly bipolar, and certainly fueled by paranoia, superstitions, and mood swings that overshadowed the comedic persona the public knew. At his funeral, an odd final comedic flourish surfaced. He had insisted that Glenn Miller's In the Mood be played, a tune that longtime comedic partners Spike Milligan and Harry Seacombe loathed. It was his last sly jab, a comedic gesture from beyond the grave that forced them to endure a piece of music they disliked. The tension, some mourners found it humorous, others macabre, symbolized how Peter Sellers orchestrated comedic chaos right until the end. whether on set, in families, or even in the funeral parlor. After his death, stories continued to swirl. Some claim that if Sellers had gotten real therapeutic help, especially in the 1970s, he might have reined in the outbursts and mania, saving multiple marriages and bridging the distance with his children. Others believe he was too far entrenched in superstition, too reliant on mediums who told him the color green was cursed, too wrapped up in a mother's overshadowing influence to let any real therapy take hold. His friend Spike Milligan, who struggled with mental health himself, once remarked that he understood some of Sellers' demons, but found them terrifying to watch up close. Hollywood, for its part, remembers him mostly for comedic genius, the earnest Clouseau, the triple role of Dr. Strangelove, or the understated comedic dryness of Being There. A handful recall that he was instrumental in forging an entire comedic era, bridging the Goon Show's surreal radio anarchy with the filmic pratfalls that made him a global phenomenon. But overshadowed by that comedic legacy are the real human casualties, the wives battered by his jealousy, the children who never truly felt paternal warmth, the colleagues who endured rants and rewrites, the health crises that grew from habit and mania. Over time, a reappraisal of Sellers' comedic line deliveries or comedic mania in film might highlight just how fluidly he embodied comedic transformations that overshadowed the real man behind them. On The Muppet Show in 1978, Kermit the Frog suggested Sellers be himself for a segment, prompting him to reply, "I could never be myself. You see, there is no me. I do not exist." That line, half comedic, half disturbing, might be the purest summation of his existence. He was a comedic shapeshifter who shaped entire comedic worlds for others to laugh at, all while privately lamenting that he had no stable identity of his own. He was overshadowed, ironically, by the comedic illusions he conjured so skillfully. The final measure of his life might then be found in how seamlessly comedic mania and private tragedy intertwined. A comedic maestro who, in forging comedic illusions, unwittingly concealed the torment that devoured him. At the 1980 Golden Globes, he soared, recognized for being there, receiving the final big pat on the back from an industry that had marveled at him since his Pink Panther heyday. Then a few months later, he dropped dead of a heart attack, leaving behind the typed illusions he'd cultivated and the heartbreak that overshadowed them. In that sense, he stands as one of the 20th century's most emblematic comedic geniuses, and one of its darkest cautionary tales about the fierce cost of comedic brilliance to a fragile psyche.